Uh, Welcome to the program on behalf of the American Friends of SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. I am Larry Michalak, Dr. Larry Michalak from UC Berkeley. And during the coming hour, we will be hearing from SOAS alum Elisabeth Kvitashvili. She will be speaking to us on current problems of structural racism and social conflict in the United States. Her idea, as you will find out, is that for too long we have thought that the United States is immune to certain kinds of problems, that they're exclusively the problems of foreign countries, but now we're finding out that that's not the case, and that we have significant unaddressed grievances that have been building up in the United States for a long time. Elisabeth will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, followed for the rest of the hour by discussion, and you will send in your questions. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge Bharti Kansara, who is in the Bay Area. She's the Vice President of the American Friends of SOAS, and she organizes many events for us in the Bay Area, for which we're very grateful. Also, I'd like to acknowledge Greg Bowie, who is the President of the American Friends of SOAS, and he is in Southern California. So for the moment, California has a monopoly on the presidency and the vice presidency. My role will be simply to introduce Elisabeth and to moderate the questions and answers, which is to read your questions that you type in. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Elisabeth Kvitashvili. She is a retired Foreign Service officer from USAID. She served for 37 years in Washington, D.C. and abroad in over a dozen countries, mainly in South Asia, Russia, and the Caucasus, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Her specialty area is disaster relief and development, and while she was with USAID, she innovated an institution called the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. She founded that office in USAID. She has also been an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for 2 years, and for 15 years she has taught off and on at Georgetown as an adjunct professor. As you can probably tell from her last name, Elisabeth Kvitashvili is partly Georgian. The V-I-L-I at the end is the giveaway. In fact, Elisabeth is an American. She's born in the United States, and she's half Georgian and half Russian. She is an alumnus of SOAS, where she did the MA program in Near and Middle Eastern Studies. She now lives across the bay from me in San Francisco, and we see each other at the wonderful events that Bharti Kansara organizes. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Elisabeth Kvitashvili, who will speak to us for 15 or 20 minutes, followed by questions.
So thanks very much, Laurence, and hello to everybody out there who joins us here today. I know it's late for many, so I want to make this as snappy as possible. So let me get to it. Before I actually start, I do want to flag two articles that are in the chat box. I refer to an article I wrote in Medium and to the Global Fragility Act. So if people are interested in reading those, getting more information, they are in the chat box as one of the first two chats there. Okay, so Laurence, I have to say that ever since I co-wrote the article that was posted on Medium in early June, calling for the immediate action from our political leaders here in the US to address our worsening conflict dynamics, we've seen an explosion of commentary, of advocacy, of calls for action against various forms of discrimination and racism, directed at many different groups, mostly minorities, and not just people of color here in the US, but globally. For example, we've seen the toppling of symbols of dehumanization and exploitation, such as monuments to King Leopold of Belgium, and statues of Spanish conquistadores who enslaved millions of indigenous Native Americans in Central and South America, all for the sake of land, silver, gold, and religion. And Laurence, you and I discussed earlier this week the debate at Oxford over the statue of Cecil Rhodes and whether it should be brought down. There's much debate in the US as to whether we need to revisit the legacy of some of our nation's most beloved historical leaders like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson. I personally think that's a bridge too far, but others believe that some of our forefathers were racist, were at a minimum enablers of discrimination. So the discussion is wide open, which is a good thing. Regardless of what I think, the conflict spark that was the death of George Floyd fed the fuel of decades of anger that in turn presented the Black Lives Matter movement here and their equivalents abroad, like the Belgian Network for Black Lives, the opportunity to awaken the global calls for justice for people of color. And these calls have gone viral. Activists in Europe are hopeful that Europe is finally ready to start dealing with issues of racial inequality and injustice on its soil, whether in Belgium, France, or England, all countries with bloody colonial pasts. For example, in London, the banks are being pressed to pay reparations over links to slavery. What we're witnessing today is a reckoning with the past that prevents us all with the opportunity to effect long overdue change for the good for many people of many races, religions, and beliefs. And indeed, in my country, in the US, it doesn't look like the demands for change will go away. They are here to stay. But the question is, are our political actors, our leaders at the local, national, international level up for the challenge? Will they make tough decisions, take actions to begin to rectify some of the perpetuated miscarriages of justice we continue to see in our world? There's some encouraging words, there's some encouraging signs, apologies for or acknowledgements of links to slavery and a lack of diversity, the removal of Confederate flags from state capitals in our South. But so much needs to be done, and the finish line is indeed a very long ways away. But let me step back a minute to remind people why we're talking today, why we're meeting today. As Laurence said, I am a former senior level U.S. Foreign Service officer who, because of my career, my circumstance, acquired a bit of expertise in the area of conflict and development. I was at the forefront of a group of government conflict experts who developed and conducted countless conflict assessments, analyzing the drivers of violence and violent conflict in countries across the globe, whether in the Sahel, the Balkans, Sri Lanka, Colombia, Guatemala, the Republic of Georgia in the Caucasus, even Russia. We undertook groundbreaking conflict assessments, trying to suss out the root causes of underlying instability, as well as trying to identify community resiliencies and local peace builders. But while our gaze was focused abroad, we did maintain an eye on our home turf as conflict dynamics in the US worsened and our perceived US exceptionalism became misplaced and in some cases replaced by what I typify an arrogance or an ignorance. America, we went to the moon, we sent a man to the moon, was perhaps not that exceptional. And conflict drivers, including systemic racism and injustice, wealth inequalities, and institutional failures in the justice and education systems, among others, accelerated at an alarming rate here at home. Who would have thought we could imagine our justice system potentially fatally compromised, as I believe it is today, and the possibility of criminal misconduct during our upcoming elections, perhaps with the support of outside interlocutors. So let me digress just a moment, though, to revisit this concept of exceptionalism and what I mean by it. As you mentioned, I am a first-generation American born of immigrant parents whose families escaped the tyrannies of communism. America meant opportunities. It signaled optimism. one came to America to pursue one's dreams while adhering to noble principles of human rights and personal freedoms that are accorded to us by documents like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The belief that working hard and sticking to your principles defined some of this exceptionalism. America was inherently different due to its history and its values, and because we had a unique mission to transform the world for the better. Under George W. Bush, that meant that the US government was going to try and bring democracy to the people of the Arab world in post 9/11. America was exceptional for these and other reasons. Our exceptionalism was not perfect, however, and over time, I have seen us try to embody our belief in America's systems and values elsewhere, whether through the less than successful nation building efforts in Iraq or Afghanistan, or transforming the developing world through technical support and assistance. We have tried to embody our values and ideals elsewhere. And yet people have reminded me as a Foreign Service officer abroad, that this, our country, is not America, and we will adopt from you what works best for us here, but we won't necessarily look like you because we are not you. Our country will not be a mini America. Our efforts today continue to be very well intentioned, but many times naive or simply misplaced for lack of understanding of the local context. My colleagues, my conflict colleagues, and I knew that violent conflict was not something that just happens elsewhere in places like Mali or El Salvador or Yemen. America was not immune, and although we did not suffer, thankfully, from ethnic or religious-based conflicts, we have many underlying challenges and grievances that, if left unaddressed, could fuel the flames of greater discontent and eventually cause instability. Our exceptionalism did not mean we had created a utopian society. Far from it. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s were significant efforts to address inequality and some weaknesses in our society, but the job remains unfinished. Laurence, while conflict drivers, including grievances over racial and social inequality, can be destabilizing, they are not sufficient to trigger violent conflict. However, when combined with means and opportunity, a country can easily slide towards violent conflict. And without overstating this, the US is kind of teetering on the edge. We're kind of like Humpty Dumpty sitting on the wall, and I hope we don't fall. But unfortunately, many political leaders, our political leaders, are fueling grievances at a frightening rate. Our president is using white vulnerability to fuel the fear that whites are losing out to others. There exists in the US a toxic social media landscape where extreme and fake messages can be easily disseminated very broadly. Foreign governments can easily spread fake information at a significant and fast pace. Combined, this rhetoric and the ability to spread disinformation fuels and enables hate groups to thrive. The rise of the Boogaloo Boys is just the latest example of such a hate group. Now, unfortunately, COVID-19 also highlights the extreme inequality in our society, as longstanding racism at all levels ensures that Black and Brown Americans are hit hardest financially, and Black and Hispanic Americans are dying at a disproportionately higher rate. Again, the consistent and sometimes bizarre disinformation from the White House about the protests and about COVID-19 has further eroded public trust and decimated our social norms. COVID-19 has rocked our nation and upended American lives, especially in the cities. We're now living in a very different country. Some say we're even living in two separate countries, the haves and the have-nots. Unemployment has reached levels not seen since the Great Depression, and the US still leads the world in COVID-19 deaths and cases. Due to unemployment, students are out of school. Due to unemployment and students being out of school, COVID-19 is also providing the opportunity and the means for people, including white Americans, to protest injustice in large numbers. So to turn violent, conflict requires a spark. And as I said earlier, the tragic killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police was the spark that led to the current outpouring of anger and desperation that we see on the streets. Violent police and militarized responses throughout the country further fueled anger as Americans watched their first American right to protest, a cornerstone of American democracy, televised every night being brutally decimated. The US is also in the middle of our election year, which is a common violence trigger. The president has made repeated claims of potential voter fraud and rigged elections, laying the predicate for challenging the results should he lose, threatening our tradition of a peaceful transition of power. Unthinkable, Laurence, right? Except last night, I heard respected television commentators mull out loud, could we see the National Guard called out and armed Trump supporters surround the White House if he refuses to concede a lost election? What kinds of violence could we see? Again, unthinkable, but maybe not so much anymore. Conflict, when addressed, is often the means through which countries make meaningful progress, whether in Sudan, Colombia, Nepal. We have success stories. Conversely, a harsh or repressive militarized response can be devastating and unfurl a potential slip into sustained nationwide violence, as we see perhaps at time in places like Hong Kong, or as we saw in Egypt a number of years ago. The administration's move to deploy heavily armed and varied federal law enforcement units, including prison guards who are not trained to police peaceful civilian protest, was provocative in my opinion, dangerous, and simply irresponsible. Thankfully, many of our military leaders have expressed their regrets for what happened in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, and hopefully will not be so duped again. Now, ironically, this past December, the United States adopted the Global Fragility Act, excuse me, which is a significant step towards forward in U.S. government planning and operations for addressing international state fragility and prevention of violent conflict. The strategy outlines how the State Department, USAID, which is the Agency for International Development where I worked, and other U.S. government agencies will engage earlier and more consistently to prevent violence and stabilize communities that have been torn apart by violence. It calls for a unified approach to prevent violence. If only we could put this act, which is focused internationally, into action here in the United States, it could save lives. Borrowing approaches we've successfully applied abroad that identify local actors who understand the dynamics on the ground in our local communities and engage with police and other security sector actors to keep violence at a minimum. Approaches that combine local level, including civil society actors, and have a national level engagement to encourage adherence to a reform agenda that addresses the systemic issues of concern to minorities and others. However, the passage of this act and its importance in signaling the US, our role as a standard bearer for promoting human rights and democratic norms, stands in stark contrast to what we currently see play out in our cities across the country. The performance of US institutions to protect voter rights, allow freedom of the press, and administer equal justice is significantly declining, and the US is now characterized as a flawed democracy by the Economist Intelligence Unit. While many are waiting for the latest round of protests to end and a vaccine for COVID-19 so that our lives can return to normal, We know that for most Americans, that normal was never acceptable. And for a significant of our population, a return to normal will remain unacceptable. We as a society, we are questioning now who we are as a nation. Americans and our local and state leaders, we all must urge our federal government to begin to take our warning seriously. Leaders at all levels, local, state, national, must step up to address long-held grievances, respond to demands for equal justice and equal access to education, broaden inclusion in our political and economic life, and take steps to de-escalate the heightened tensions leading our country dangerously close to erupting into large-scale violence, perhaps, again, encouraged by outsiders. Now, let me shift gears for just a second. 3 years ago, a friend of mine in the Bay Area introduced me to a grad school friend of hers. This woman, a Bosnian who resettled in the US after the war ended in 1995, she was working to assist victims of human trafficking here in California.
Okay.
I hadn't realized that trafficking was an issue in California. For those of us who had worked in post-war Bosnia, like I did, and Kosovo, we knew trafficking of young women was, and indeed remains, an issue where displacement, poor governance, corruption, poverty combined it to make it very easy to trade in human flesh. I was struck by how this young woman with a master's degree in international development from a prestigious East Coast university was directing her attention at a problem here at home in the US rather than focusing her energies internationally. Now, since retiring from my career as a Foreign Service officer with USAID in 2015, almost daily I read about the many development challenges I dealt with in my own international development career: improving the quality and safety of education, improving the quality and safety of elections and their outcomes, rehabilitating the housing stock and public infrastructure, including roads and bridges, improving access to quality health care, getting better decision-making from our leaders. The challenges we've been discussing during this little talk, stories of poverty, injustice, inequality, including racial inequality, abound in the newspapers. What makes these stories stand out is that they're all homegrown, as we've already noted. The development challenges I spent my entire professional life trying to address abroad can be found no further than Kansas, my own backyard, to borrow from Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. International development specialists and peace builders like to think we know how to fix fragile states, to address issues of poverty, ethnic and religious inequality, market development, the whole gamut of development challenges. Our toolkit includes financial and technical support, whether to Honduras or Bosnia or Afghanistan, Nepal, Burundi, Jordan, all countries I know well because I served there. We seek out and engage partners who embrace empowerment of local leaders, women's empowerment, broad inclusion of stakeholders, ethnic and religious tolerance, adherence to the rule of law, the creation of a fair system of governance, and the equitable and sustainable distribution of government social services in the health and education sectors, among others. Yet, recent events here at home call into question whether we are actually practicing any of these approaches here in the United States. I've been privileged to serve, as you noted, as an adjunct professor at a number of prestigious universities where I've mentored and continue to mentor scores of grad students launching their international development careers. My message today to a young generation of peace builders and international development practitioners is to think local. Just as President John F. Kennedy called for a young generation to go abroad and help foster democracy through the Peace Corps, those of you excited about working abroad might consider instead looking at your home community, whether it's here in the United States, in Sri Lanka, in Kenya, wherever you call home, and offering your insights and skills where you can there. Your generation is likely to see the U.S. be not only a supplier of development solutions, but the recipient of lessons learned abroad as well. The exceptionalism we like to speak about, the "we sent a man in the moon" era, has been significantly diminished, and many countries now outpace us in a number of areas. You and your colleagues may find that international development will include tripartite learning, or the problems of governance, or access to quality healthcare and education, or fighting infectious disease, will include case studies of U.S. cities and communities. For example, for all our healthcare advances here in the United States, in 2019, the World Health Organization ranks the U.S. 55th, just behind Russia and just ahead of Ukraine in maternal mortality statistics. All Americans abroad serve as representatives of our country, whether formally as members of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps, like I was, or informally as Americans working, studying, traveling abroad. Your engagement today can help others rediscover our voice as a force for positive change in the world. Our leadership is valued and our voice counts. We must rebuild our ability to engage productively internationally in such a way that upholds human rights, reestablishes a commitment to address climate change, and advances democracy, among other things. We're not living up to our role as a leader of the civilized world. We've lost our perspective, presume an arrogance of power, when all the while we ignore our own homegrown problems, our significant inequalities that we decry elsewhere and ignore in our own backyard. To recover our moral voice for positive change, we must tackle our own problems and thereby serve, once again, as an exemplar for the changes now being demanded by many of our fellow citizens here in the US and throughout the globe. The fires are burning, and your generation must pave the way to quell the flames, if not extinguish them. Without a doubt, there will be a lot to do to recover the lost ground in our diplomatic and development institutions. But there may be greater opportunities to explore problems that the U.S. shares with the rest of the world, contributing to both local and global solutions. In 5 years, who knows, international development studies at SOAS may just be called global challenges. And the solutions, excuse me, and the solutions, including to our own problems, may be the ones that you all are working on both here and abroad. So with that, I'll throw it back to you, Larry. You're on mute. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Okay, now I have a voice.
Okay.
I hope. Thank you, Elisabeth. That was a very enlightening talk. And I'd like to invite those of you that are listening, I see we have a couple dozen, to type questions into the chat box. We've already got a few, and I will put them to Elisabeth. So Elisabeth, let me start by abusing my role as the moderator and asking the first question, which will have some time to type in. This is something that you've already addressed to a certain extent in your talk, this question of American exceptionalism. To what extent is what's happening in the United States the same or different from what's happening in Europe? Because we see that there are a lot of things, such as the statues being pulled down, symbols of identity, but sometimes it's contrasted in terms of internal colonialism in the US versus external in Europe and other ways. So I guess my question is, how does the controversy currently in the United States differ from that in other parts of the world, or does it?
Okay, thanks for the question. So first, recognizing I don't purport to be an expert. This is Elisabeth speaking based on her experience and based on her own thinking. I would suggest that since racism and discrimination thrive, unfortunately, worldwide, that this phenomena we're seeing in the United States is not different from what's happening overseas. Different people in different countries view different institutions and individuals as having either fostered or perpetuated some form of discrimination and racism. And therefore, as I said, this spark that was George Floyd allowed a generation of voices to come forward and protest, whether here or Belgium or the Middle East or wherever. It's not a singular phenomena here, nor is it a singular phenomena in England. Unfortunately, racism and discrimination, slavery, it's existed throughout history. I think what we have here now is some commonality and the ability for people to work more closely together to protest against it, and perhaps to take forward some recommended solutions, either at the local level, the national level, or perhaps at the global level. So I guess the short answer, I see more commonality than I do distinction. That's not to say that that there haven't been excesses. I think in some cases there have been some excesses. You know, I'm not going to be a defender of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, but they were among our most distinguished and honorable founding fathers. And I think they did much for our country to make it what it is today. They brought forth ideas and institutions that have made us what we are today. Are they perfect? No. Can everything be improved? Yes. But I worry sometimes that a pendulum swings too far to the right or left, and we have to find that modicum in the middle that allows us to move forward and address these issues that we have in a manner that is hopefully as non-violent as possible.
Okay. Actually, since you mentioned violence, I see that we have an interesting question, which is the US Constitution only allows the right to protest peacefully. Burning cities is not peaceful. The way you prevent violence is to arrest those who engage in it. The mayors in Seattle and Minneapolis told the police to stand down, which is why there was chaos. After 2 young Black teenagers were killed, the mayors finally did their jobs. So there's one for you to respond to.
So what is the question?
Well, I guess it's
should there not be violence?
I guess it's a question about evaluating what's going on in the cities and how the response is taking place, which gets into your expertise in what do you do to mitigate violence.
First, you have to understand why someone, an individual or a group of people, have chosen violence as their method of response. I mean, clearly, most practitioners of conflict theory and peace builders would argue for finding a way to open a dialogue in order to resolve the issue. That being said, if there have been attempts at dialogue, whether over days, years, months, generations, and that dialogue does not amount to anything, it doesn't address the structural problem that people are protesting against, I can understand why somebody would choose violence as an alternative. The key, and this was a point I made earlier, and one of the things the Global Fragility Act is trying to do, is to get to the problem early, understand what it is, and try to address it before it blows up into your face. And unfortunately, what we have is, years, decades of discrimination of all forms. gender discrimination, racial, religious, all kinds of discrimination that are unfortunately, I think, inherent in mankind. And we've not done a good job of addressing it in such a way that people are feeling, okay, well, if no one's listening to me, if you're not fixing this problem, I'm going to take to the streets so that you will understand my anger and frustration. I don't condone it. I understand it. I understand why people choose that.
Okay. Here is another question from the South Bay. NPR reported on July 13th that Tiana Spears, a Black Foreign Service officer, had suffered repeated racist stops, searches, and slurs by Border Patrol officers while on duty looking at migration trends on the US-Mexico border. More troubling still, she also said that she suffered racism in the State Department itself, often being passed over for promotions. Her experience was that State Department officials were expected to fit the profile of pale, male, and Yale. The racism got so bad that she was forced to leave. How is it that it is not just poorly educated white supremacist Trump supporters, but elite State Department officials who have perpetrated racist stereotyping even in the State Department itself?
So I'm familiar with Ms. Spears' case to the extent that I read about in some State Department documents. And I do know that there were attempts to understand why she felt that she had been discriminated against apparently repeatedly over her relatively short career, and how the department could begin to address it. Now let me step back for a second. A number of years ago, I believe under then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, there was an attempt made at State Department, indeed at AID, to reform our hiring practices in order to ensure that we were recruiting from a more diverse segment of our population, so that we would move away from the white Anglo-Saxon stereotype. I know the department and AID have improved the percentage of diverse candidates that they've brought on board. There is a program called the Payne Fellows, for example, which specifically brings in minority and underrepresented populations into the State Department and into AID in order to begin to address this disparity in numbers of people we have in the agencies, and to try and build in greater opportunities for peoples of color to have the kinds of opportunities to grow their career. So it's understood as a problem, and there have been efforts, apparently not completely successful, to address them. Does that mean that people like Ms. Spears will not suffer racism? I'm shocked, I'm disappointed, but I'm not necessarily surprised. As a white woman, early in my career in the Foreign Service, I faced some challenges as well because I was a woman. I think as a person of color, she might have suffered even greater challenges. That being said, I think it's understood, and they're trying to address it. And I wish Ms. Spears would not have resigned, but given the department greater opportunities to address her issues and to address those and to challenge those who she felt had discriminated against her.
Okay, very good. I might add that we had a comment that really addresses more the question than your answer, that Trump supporters are not necessarily all that uneducated. But anyway,
I agree. I agree. Yeah.
But that was in the question and not your answer. Okay, here's another question for you. Dr. Kvitashvili, regarding—
I'm not doctor. I'm just I'm not a PhD. Didn't get there.
We'll give you an honorary doctorate. Okay, Regarding George Floyd's murder this year that sparked national outrage, what is different about that situation compared to Mike Brown's murder in 2014, while also igniting national anger, but was met with way more dismissal and smearing against the Black Lives Matter movement? As we know, communities of color have always faced police brutality. What is special about George Floyd's public execution that awakened many compared to many similar instances that happen across the US? The Trump administration plays into white fragility. Logically, would this not mean more opposition against racial equality movements?
So I don't know that there is any difference. Any victim of police brutality should be saying the same. They're a victim of police brutality, right? I think what has happened is that over the last 4 years, we've seen an increase in the public discourse of racist, discriminatory dialogue. We've become a nation that, for whatever reason, has a hard time finding consensus and finding an ability to resolve problems. And I suspect, as I said in my little talk, with George Floyd, it was just the spark. It was like, that's it, one last straw, not anything more. And because, again, under this administration, there have been, the rhetoric is so negative. It's so discriminatory in many ways that I think it came to a head. It came to a head. And I think you have a white constituency, I'm not going to characterize them, that is equally aware and afraid of where this nation is heading. Remember, I said, in many cases, we don't know ourselves anymore. I don't recognize this country, my country. There are parts of the country that I probably would not feel at all comfortable in. Why? Because we've become so completely polarized. And I think Mr. Floyd's murder was almost like the tip of the spear. That was it. And you have whole segments of the American public, of all colors, all religions, left, right, whatever, who just were sickened by it and have said, that's it, enough's enough. We can't let it continue like this. If our politicians aren't going to do anything about it, we, the civilians, have got to take this into our own hands. And we took to the streets. We took to the streets just like people did in the 1960s to have their voice heard, because people are not listening.
Okay, we have a comment. George Floyd's murder was more graphic, with the 8+ minute video and the police refusing to stop it and staying on his neck. There was nothing like it. Actually, I was going to throw in myself the comment that a big difference about abuses of Black people and police violence nowadays is that you're getting it on film. The first instance of this was Rodney King. In a way, it's almost as if it's like the old adage about if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if somebody is abused by the police and if there's no video, it makes a big difference.
You're right. It's the video. It's also the ability to communicate instantaneously so that messages go out virally via social media, whether it's Twitter or WhatsApp or whatever. The ability to communicate on a global basis instantaneously has both allowed the global community to be much more aware of what's happening, to react much more quickly to what's happening, and has made us just, it's the news cycle never ends now, right? Because it's always there, and it makes us more conscious of all that more the bad stuff that's going on, because you don't hear about good stuff on the news anymore. It's all bad stuff. And as I said, it's this constant drumbeat of negativity that I think has just worn us all down. And the visuals of George Floyd were perhaps just the step too far. Like I said, it was the spark. Why him and not somebody else? You can only go so far, and then you can't take it anymore. And I think it was it.
Very good. Here's another question for you. Do you think we should have South African-style truth and reconciliation committees between police and the Black community in the U.S. to bring racial injustices to the light of day and provide closure to police and the Black community?
So the South African model, the Rwandan model, where they use the gacaca courts, is another model where you bring antagonists, opposing sides together in a formal setting to kind of talk through what happened and why. I think, as I suggested, there are a number of approaches that have been tried abroad that we could learn from and perhaps model for an American audience, an American perspective. I think it would be a good idea. Now, should we do it nationwide? No. I think what we probably need to do is have a number of police communities. Let's say Minneapolis, where the police chief appears to be somebody sensible. Perhaps Atlanta, I don't really know. A couple of different communities explore different models, and between them try and come up with a model that fits the US context. And maybe this model would have to be molded, contextualized for Atlanta versus Baltimore, which has a problem, versus New York, which is, of course, is much bigger. It shouldn't just be one size fits all. It needs to be molded to fit the local context. How a Latino community engages with the police may or may not be slightly different from how a white Southern community engages with the police. But these are models that we can learn from and perhaps apply here, both police communities and using civil society, local actors who understand the local dynamics. Some of the local activists, for example, who have the ability to cross between those who are the victims of police violence and the police or security sector themselves. That was a good suggestion.
Okay. Let's see, we have about 10 minutes left, so we have time for a couple more questions if people would like to type them in. But we have one here. When did this slide towards the new Jim Crow and the erosion of our democratic institutions begin, and what was the impetus behind it? Hard question.
So I'm not going to pick a date. The structural racism we've had has existed since the founding of our country. And even though we eliminated slavery after the Civil War, obviously structural racism of a different sort has remained, and it's no longer just focused on African Americans, but other people of color, perhaps other religions as well. So I wouldn't pick a date. What I would say is I want to go back to a couple of things. One, I think what we have seen. I'm not an economist, but I'm going to say perhaps since about 2009, after the last financial crisis, where we had a significant percentage of the population, I don't know what it is, who was pretty significantly impacted by the crisis, lost their homes, lost jobs, perhaps have not been able to recover their losses since that time, or perhaps have, but not to the level they had before. We're seeing a growing disparity between the, the haves and have-nots. You have an increasing number of extraordinarily wealthy people with, unfortunately, a growing number of people in poverty in the United States, people who are below minimum wage. Now, we have to include in those statistics, of course, recent immigrants, perhaps people who are here illegally. So a growing segment of the population who have been unable to find the American dream economically. And so you have these growing disparities. And at the same time, you have, as we've said, social media, through everything available instantaneously, the perception that I'm not participating in the wealth of the country. I don't have access to good quality education. I and my family don't have good quality health care because of where I live. I am disadvantaged. And unfortunately, again, we're not seeing that shrinking, we're seeing it expanding. Why? I can't necessarily say, but I would say, without trying to be overtly political, that the last 4 years of the Trump administration, I think, has worsened for many people the ability to get ahead. While jobs have been created, they may not have been the high-paying jobs that are necessary to sustain a family. We've not seen improvements in healthcare. We've not seen improvements in education. And the rhetoric is extraordinarily negative. It's extraordinarily pessimistic. It's the opposite of what we had under the previous administration, under President Obama. All this negativism, all this pessimism, combined with loss of jobs now with COVID, loss of opportunity, I think has impacted. So it's just grown worse, and we have to address it before it gets out of control. We're not the land of opportunity we once were. We can be, and there are people who still have successfully transitioned and are living the American dream, but it's not happening for enough people here in the United States, in my opinion, and the divide is growing.
Okay. I think we've got time for about one more question. And here's an interesting comparative question. Do you see any comparison to the rise in hate incidents in the US and hateful rhetoric to ethnic conflicts like that in former Yugoslavia? So here's a comparison for you.
So I would say, and again, I don't purport to be an expert, but based on my time there and working and reading and listening to locals on the ground, the conflict in the Balkans writ large, including Bosnia, but not just Bosnia, there were a lot of long held, I mean centuries old historical grievances there. I mean, our history is 200 years old. These were dating back to the Middle Ages. So there were some historical grievances. There were also grievances that were more recent, that dated back to World War II. And those, in this part of the world, those grievances were not only profound, but they did not disappear. So it was people who had a lot of grudges. So that was one thing. We don't have the same perspective on that here because we don't have that kind of history. We've never had that kind of long-standing conflict on our territory outside of the Civil War that Europe has seen. So that's one thing. The second thing, you had a desire for freedom among people who hadn't tasted freedom, in some cases for hundreds of years. And whether you were Croatian or Bosniak or Serbian, you no longer wish to be ruled by another. You wanted independence, and you wanted an integrated whole country, which necessarily meant you didn't want the other participating here. Once again, we've never had that kind of experience because despite the amount of immigration we've had in this country, despite the fact that we're all people from somewhere, besides the Native Americans, we're all from somewhere. Our communities are pretty homogeneous, right? You've got maybe the Italians in some community, or the Chinese American in some community. By and large, we're Americans. We're from Boston or Philadelphia or San Francisco. But in this part of the world, you had people who truly believed in their ethnicity and in their history, and they wanted that independence. They wanted to be whole once again after generations of either Turkish rule or Austro-Hungarian rule, or then communist rule. So I think there were some differences, more differences than there are similarities.
Okay, very good. We have only about 3 or 4 minutes left, so we've almost come to the end of the time. I wonder whether Greg Bowie would like to say something, because I think that there's some technological way that he can speak for us. But in any case, I wanted to thank you for your stimulating presentation.
Didi Madloba. Somebody asked me to say something in Georgian, so I said Didi Madloba, which is you're welcome in Georgian.
Very good. Okay. By the way, for those who are watching, if you'd like to read more of Elisabeth Kvitashvili's work, there is an icon on the invitation to the conference that you can click to read a text that she did. I'd also like to thank Bharti Kansara and Greg Bowie for organizing the program. And I wanted to add that SOAS would appreciate any donations, as the institution is suffering from the adverse economic impacts of the pandemic. I think that Greg is going to put in a link for donations in the chat box with options for donating to specific causes. So I think that that's it. Can you think of anything else to add?
No, I can't. I hope everybody has enjoyed our little chat. And once again, I do want to say I don't consider myself an expert, but my field experience has left me with a lot of impressions and concerns about the way our nation is being led today. And I encourage everybody to make sure that they vote this fall for whichever party they choose, whichever candidate they choose, and that everybody make sure their voice is heard, their concerns are heard, so that we have elected leaders who will begin to address some of these problems we've been discussing today.
Very good. So on behalf of our speaker, Elisabeth Kvitashvili, and myself, and on behalf of the American Friends of the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and we wish you a good remainder of the day. Bye-bye.